Okay. So, welcome everyone. This is another Wednesday evening conversation, Wednesday evening Dhamma discussion through the Clear Mountain Monastery YouTube channel. It's nice to see people joining in. Hey. All right, so this evening, we will be just continuing to discuss the Mattaññū Sutta, which is a discourse in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Sevens, Sutta number 64. And the link to that discourse is in the notes. So you can feel free to follow along. We've been following the 7 different Dhammas which are mentioned in this discourse, which are basically, we can consider them and have been considering them 7 different types of intelligence, 7 different cognitive skills which we can develop on the path in which the Buddha suggested were a good thing to develop on the path. So those 7 are what we've called Dhammic intelligence, or basically having a knowledge of the Dhamma, of the scriptural Dhamma. So having studied to some degree or another. And the second knowledge is what we call intuitive intelligence or translative intelligence. This is the ability to know the meaning. So once you've memorized or read various different discourses, teachings of the Buddha, you're able to not just parrot them back or not just memorize all the different parts and aspects, all the different lists which the Buddha loves to give, but you're actually able to discern the content and the real meaning and essence of it. That's the Mattaññū. Then there's what we're calling intrapersonal intelligence. It's the 3rd type of intelligence, which is a knowledge of yourself and knowing your capacities in different ways. And today we'll be talking about the 4th type of intelligence, also known as Mattaññū in Pali. That's Matta, which means the measure, and Aññū, intelligence or knowing. So the intelligence which knows the right amount. Or another way to think about this and talk about this is quantitative intelligence. You know the right quantity of different things. And specifically in a Buddhist context, it's always about the mind. It's always about mental development and seeing things clearly. So knowing the right quantity as it relates to growth in Dhamma. And we'll flesh out this meaning through the course of this evening's talk. And the other 3 types of intelligence are temporal intelligence, knowing the right time, social intelligence, knowing about different types of groups, and the intelligence which is able to make distinctions among individuals. So this evening, as with other Wednesday nights, we'll have about half an hour of discussion on Mattaññū, and then we'll open it up to question and answers for about 15 minutes. And I'll begin with the traditional homage to the Triple Gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Okay. So what is Mattaññū? What does it mean to know the measure? I'll read the source text, the Anguttara 764, what it says on this account. So, and how is a practitioner one who has quantitative intelligence, or how is one who knows the measure? Here, a practitioner knows the measure in accepting robes, alms food, lodging, and medicinal requisites, medicinal provisions for the sick. Because they know the measure in accepting robes, alms food, lodging, and medicinal requisites for the sick, they are called one who has quantitative intelligence, or one who knows the measure. So this discourse highlights 4 different arenas of consumption, which are somewhat monastic specific. In Buddhist circles, we call these the 4 requisites. And although they are phrased in a renunciant specific way, like alms food, I mean, normal people don't eat alms food. They are more generalizable to apply and be applicable to anyone and everyone, because everyone has need to greater or lesser extent for these 4 different material supports for life. That is, for monks, it's phrased in terms of robes, but this just means clothing. So what is the right amount of clothing? Okay. The second requisite is alms food for monastics, and for non-monastics, that's just food. How do you eat? When do you eat? How much do you eat? What kind of things do you eat? These are the questions which fall under this umbrella term of knowing the measure, knowing the right amount, the right quantity of food. The third requisite is lodging. So for monks, this is a hut or a dorm or wherever we happen to be staying, a cave, in the open air, at the root of a tree. These are all places which, still today it's common for monks to dwell. Even in America, there are monks who live in, certainly who live in small huts or live out in the open, who live in small tents or under tarps. But for more generalizedly, this is just your home. How great a mortgage do you need to put out for your lodging? How much, do you really need? How many rooms do you need? How large a house do you need? What neighborhood do you live in? These are considerations for knowing the measure of lodging. And the last one is medicinal requisites, which are defined actually quite at great length in the rules for monks. So there's all sorts of traditional herbal medicines which we use, but for lay people, for non-monks, this is basically just, what kind of healthcare you get, and how can you be one who's intelligent in this regard. So one thing which is always important to ask is, why is this important? Hopefully, most people can just intuit why this is important. There are a group of, not just a few people, especially in America, who are new to Buddhism. And when they learn about the Buddha's teachings, all they see is meditation, and they don't get a bigger picture of what training of the mind really entails on a larger perspective. But for anybody who's really looking at their life, looking at the results of their actions, it becomes quite clear that what you put into your body and the things that you consume and the amount of time you spend consuming those things, that's a huge part of your day. I mean, even just based on the amount of time you spend looking for these things or saving up to get these things. And it has a huge effect on the mind. Why this is important, why it's important to know the measure, is because for many people, perhaps even most people, if you're unintelligent with regards to quantity, you have a low quantitative intelligence, you eat too much on a regular basis, you spend too much on a regular basis, you just have way too much stuff on the regular, then that's going to eat up your time, and it's going to eat up your headspace. Your house is going to be filled with junk, and that's going to eat up your physical environment, and that has an effect on the mind, and even more for many people than does, say, 15 minutes or even an hour of meditation in the morning and in the evening. This is not to denigrate the importance of meditation. I highly, of course, recommend meditation for everyone, but you should take it as an equally valid and good goal to get your eating under control in a way. You get your consumption under control. So that's what this is about. This is consumptive intelligence. We can consider it in that way as well. So what does it mean to know the measure, the matta? So in some of the translations, people will see that some translators actually translate matta as moderation, so knowing moderation. In Thailand, they translate this as knowing padi, knowing actually that which is enough. Yeah. So how do you know contentment? Yeah, that's what the Thai translation is pointing to. Knowing contentment, knowing the right amount. Ajahn Jayasara makes a good point that to know the right amount is not just to know, is not just to have an ideal picture in your mind or an ideal thought of this is the right amount and that's, or this is the minimum and that's what you should take as your goal. But yeah, knowing the measure is not knowing the minimum, not knowing how little you can eat. It's good to know that on one level, but it's knowing the optimum. Yeah, it's knowing the optimum amount. And so I think it's more useful rather than thinking of moderation or rather than thinking of like some kind of middling amount between too much and too little. It's good to think of quantitative intelligence in terms of knowing the quantity which will lead to the optimum results. But this leads to the next question, which is optimum for what? Yeah. If your goal in life is to just consume as much pleasurable things as possible, just to eat as much delicious food, to touch as many, very soft and nice to touch things, to have as many clothes and be as fancy as you want all the time. If your goal in life is fanciness and deliciousness, if that's your primary goal, then you have a certain idea of what is the right amount. And in that case, one might say that there's no right amount. Basically, the more the better. So the question for you to ask yourself is, what does it mean, the right amount for what? So in the Buddhist sense, what are we taking as our goal? So the food we eat, the clothes we use, the lodging we use, our houses, our medicines, why are we using them? And once we have that clearly in mind, then we can get a better sense of what the range is for the right amount, for the measure, for the matta. And I think one useful rule of thumb, one useful heuristic for this is in a Buddhist context, maybe we can, there are two kind of overarching goals which we can think of in terms of how we gauge our usage, our consumption. The first is whether what we're consuming is increasing wholesome dhammas and decreasing unwholesome dhammas. That's the definition of right effort. And really, in a Theravada context, that's really what we are aiming at in all of our actions. So the food we eat, we are trying to eat just the right amount such that we increase wholesome mental states and decrease unwholesome mental states. In our usage of clothing and the clothes we buy, we are trying to figure out the right amount for increasing wholesome dhammas and decreasing unwholesome dhammas. With regards to lodging, one sub-facet, which is very, very important to consider. So the Pali word for lodging, senasana, really means the place where we sit and lie down. And this question of lying down really leads into sleep. So what is the right amount of sleep? Right amount for what? The right amount of sleep so that we increase wholesome dhammas and decrease unwholesome dhammas. What's the right amount of meditation? Yeah. What's the right quantity of meditation? How many minutes? Okay. Optimum for what? Optimize so as to increase the wholesome and decrease the unwholesome. Here, it's useful to learn some Pali terms if you don't already know them. They're not popular, so these words do not yet exist in English dictionaries, as do the words Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, Nirvana, etc. But these primary terms for wholesome and unwholesome are not yet popular in English, which is unfortunate because it's such a crucial and central aspect of how we incline our lives. And the word for wholesome is kusala, Kusala, and the word for unwholesome is akusala. So that's the same word kusala with a, which is a prefix negation that goes on the beginning. So unwholesome, akusala, Akusala. So one way to remember this goal as we apply it to our consumption habits is what we can call the KAKe test. Yeah, the KAKe test. You could pronounce it KAKe test, but that's less exciting. But the KAKe test with a long A, KAKe, is the kusala akusala test. So when you are deciding where you go for lunch, or if you're going to take that next bite of your 60th bite of food for lunch, you can ask yourself, you can do the KAKe test, which is, will this next bite, will this in the long term lead to the increase of kusala and the decrease of akusala? Will this lead to wholesome mind states like brightness and energy? Or will it lead to unwholesome mind states like lethargy and greed or even anger, etc.? So that's the KAKe test. Another measure which the Buddha gave us for thinking about our consumption is just in regards to happiness. Yeah. So the reason we are trying to do moderation, the reason we're trying to figure out the right amount of the things that we use throughout the day is because we want to be happy. And the Buddha's path is not one of complete negation of happiness. Really, the Buddhist path is a path of increasing happiness. Increasing happiness, and not just increasing happiness, but increasing pleasure. So this is something which many people new to Buddhism who might just hear the First Noble Truth that, especially if it's wrongly or badly phrased, that life is suffering, you think, oh my gosh, this is the most depressing religion ever. Why would I, spend my time doing something which is just going to let me see the truth of how horrible everything is? But that's not taking into account the pleasures and happinesses, which are really essential to the path. So in the factor for right concentration, we see sukha, which is happiness. And that's the kind of happiness we're trying to refine our happiness, refine our pleasures. A very useful quote is the Dhammapada, verse 290. This is, if by renouncing a lesser happiness, one may realize a greater happiness, let the wise person renounce the lesser, having regard for the greater. So, yeah, when you're on your 60th bite, and again, this is something which monks really do. I mean, we really do count the bites that we take. I mean, not all monks, it's not a rule that we have to count our bites, but I know many, many monks who count how many bites they take. It's a lot easier when you're only eating 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day. If you're eating like 3 or 4 or more meals a day, you might just get tired of just 1, 2, 3. But for a monk or a practitioner who's only eating 1 meal a day, counting your your bites really gives you a measurement to work with. I believe it's Lord Kelvin, who was the physicist at the end of who lived in the 1800s, who came up with a measurement of heat that we call kelvins. But he had a very interesting statement, which I believe he was talking about measuring the physical world. But the statement was, if you want something to count, find a way to count it. Yeah. So, and another sentiment is counting anything is better than counting nothing. So if you want something to change in your life, if you feel like you don't yet really have a sense of the right measure, you don't have a good sense of how much is enough with regards to food or sleep or meditation or your internet use, then experiment. Find as many measurements of these things as you can, and that can give you data to work with. Yeah. So if you are counting your bites and even recording them, and for people who are not at all inclined to this type of measurement, no pressure at all. If it seems like a totally dorky or nerdish, renunciant monk thing to do for someone who's like totally bored and doesn't have anything else to do, then no pressure. Please continue not counting your bites. But if you think, oh, that's an interesting idea, why not? I've eaten probably tens of thousands of meals in my life so far, if not, over 100,000. Oh, why don't I just experiment with, my next meal? Why don't I try to count my mouthfuls? And then you'll have a sense, if you take this data from day to day, that, oh yeah, when I had 64 mouthfuls yesterday, in the afternoon I felt sluggish, or I couldn't sleep in the evening, whatever it is. So keeping track of these things can help you figure out, keeping track both of the quantity and the result on mind states, the kusala and akusala, and your happiness level. I mean, to some extent, that extra bite number 67, you notice the bite count is going up. Bite count number 67, there is some pleasure to it. Yeah, the Buddha isn't denying that. If he said that if there were no pleasure in the world, then beings wouldn't become infatuated with things in the world. But because there is pleasure in the world, that's why people become obsessed with sensual pleasures. But you measure that happiness, like if by renouncing the lesser happiness or the lesser pleasure, the word is sukha in the Dhammapada verse, if by renouncing the lesser pleasure of, the kind of deliciousness of this perfectly umami balanced, salty, sweet taste, if by renouncing that, which really is only going to last, this distance, and then it's down the throat. It's only going to last not even, a few seconds. If you savor it, if you're a slow food eater, you might have a few seconds with that bite of sensual hit, perfect umami, sweetness, etc., the optimum mouthfeel, etc. But weigh this happiness. If by renouncing that lesser pleasure, you realize a greater pleasure, a greater happiness, like clarity of mind and not feeling all kind of like woozy from having eaten too much, then the wise person will renounce that tiny little pleasure. I mean, look, it's just like tip of the lips to basically the back of the throat. And not even the back of the throat, the back of the mouth. Just that much. Not trying to totally bash on food. And there's a lot of making food for other people is a beautiful thing. There is pleasure in eating, and being able to appreciate taste. Can give you a greater appreciation of the work that went into creating that food. But just measuring these things and weighing them in your mind. This is the intelligence that knows how to weigh things correctly. So yeah, mostly these talks are, in one sense, they're pretty long. They're pretty long for YouTube, but for for a Dhamma talk, usually Dhamma talks are in forest monasteries. In Thai forest monasteries, Dhamma talks can go like, I've been at Dhamma talks which go like 3 hours with someone up on a kind of raised seat just talking for 3 hours, like starting at 8 p.m. Or a monk who like talks at you for an hour and a half before the meal. Oh my gosh, you're like waiting there and thinking the meal is going to come anytime, and somebody's like talking at you for an hour and a half. One needs to know the measure in Dhamma talks as well. Yeah, both speaking and listening. And so this is an experiment with the 30-minute format of Dhamma talks. So mostly all of our examples have been in the food realm. We could equally have gone into how much time we give to sleep, what it means to know the measure of sleep. And just to briefly touch on that is, you want to sleep the amount of time that optimizes your mindfulness. Yeah. So take the KAKe test with regards to your sleep and take mindfulness as your governing principle. Maybe the 8 hours or 7 to 9 hours that most sleep experts recommend for people who are over 24 or something, or over 18, then maybe that 7 to 9 is good for you, but maybe you need more, or maybe you need less. But experiment and figure out what works for you in terms of clarity of mind, of mindfulness, of sati. We could have talked about, and knowing the measure also relates to our internet use. And this is another thing which, to measure anything about it is better than measuring nothing. So getting some kind of app which allows you to track your time is very useful. And again, why do you use it? You should be using it if you're wanting to basically increase your happiness and follow the Buddha's teaching. How much internet use is optimal for increase of wholesome dhammas and decrease of unwholesome dhammas? And just to touch very briefly, not nearly long enough, on meditation time. So there's a somewhat funny discourse where the Buddha says, he's talking about 2 types of contentment. He says that before being enlightened, he had complete contentment with regards to the material world. So with regards to alms food and lodging and clothing, medicines, he had complete contentment. Whatever he got, whatever the quantity, he was content with it. It's like, good enough, all right. But he said there's one thing which he was not content with. What is that? Maybe you can try to answer before I give the answer, the spoiler. He was not content with the wholesome dhammas, the wholesome mental qualities which he had already cultivated. So he intentionally was always looking to increase wholesome mental states and decrease unwholesome mental states. Now that is a teaching which really does need to be unpacked, and I suggest everyone reflect on it and don't just take it in a facile or in a superficial way, because I think there are other places where the Buddha does praise contentment on a mental level. So it's a subtle thing which really needs some discernment to parse out. But the Buddha did say in another discourse that while energy is sometimes useful, sometimes not, while investigating dhammas is sometimes useful, sometimes not, depending on what's going on in your mind at the moment, cultivating tranquility is sometimes useful, sometimes not. Cultivating samadhi is sometimes useful, sometimes not. Cultivating equanimity, even, he says, is sometimes useful, sometimes not. But mindfulness is always and in every situation useful. So you can take, if you want to be immoderate if you have a tendency, like some people say, oh man, I just have a totally like obsessive or addictive personality. If you have an addictive personality, then try to figure out the measure with regards to all of your things which you've felt addicted to in the past, but let yourself become addicted to mindfulness and wisdom. That's allowable in the Buddhist context. So, all right, let's end the talk there and open things up for question and answers. Okay, so a couple comments. Just one comment that 3-hour Dhamma talks sound like heaven. It might sound like heaven, but when you are sleepy and it's like 11 p.m. and maybe it's heaven ideally, but maybe if it was the Buddha or someone who you were totally inspired with, then 3 hours might be optimal. Or maybe Sabaka Umaro, maybe you have a special abilities in this realm to have a very high tolerance for meditation talks. Okay, so this is a suggestion that there is an app called Stay Free that may be suitable to track phone usage. Yeah, so this is a good point. There are quite a few apps that people can use. I think on iPads and iPhones these days, there's like a native app which just comes with the phone, which tracks all of one's, how one uses the internet and actually how one uses all one's apps. So that can be really useful. Of course, at the time of the Buddha, when he was talking about knowing the measure, he didn't, of course, have apps, and he didn't, monks could, track the amount of bites that they're taking. In fact, there are a number of instances. There's one discourse, it's actually a poem by Sariputta, where he's talking about the optimum amount of food. And he says that you should eat until 5 bites from full. I believe that's the quote. So keep eating until you know, 5 bites from now, I would be full. And what that suggests to me is that, how would you know if you're 5 bites from full unless you had been counting on previous days to know what your general full rate is. You could take that 5 bites just to mean, eat until you know that, just before you're going to be too full. But there weren't all these fancy ways to track your time as we have today with these apps. But there were other ways, like meditation time. There weren't clocks in the time of the Buddha. There weren't clocks in the time, for most of history that there have been monastics in Buddhism. But people find ingenious ways to count the time in Japan and probably every Buddhist country, because monks, we get bored and ingenious and find ways to track things. You can use a incense stick. Most incense sticks are about the same length if you buy them together, and it takes about the same amount of time for one incense stick to go down. So that's one way of tracking time that doesn't require any kind of digital device. You can use the measurement of the sun. You'll sit from when, say, a sundial or even a stick in the ground, goes from this shadow to that shadow. There's just, if you don't happen to have any of these, a device or any fancy way to track your hours, you can always find unfancy and much simpler ways to track your hours. Okay, so here's a quote, or here's a question. So, like a hut to be only certain dimensions, but isn't it just more important that the hut is of genuine, modest design? Oh, sorry, there was a question before that. So, Yeah, so there are rules for monastics in terms of creating the size of a hut. So it's against the rules for monks to design a hut which is 12 hand spans, and it's yeah. So basically, yeah. If you look at the Buddhist monastic code, it's 12 by 7 measurements, which are hard to translate into English. But it's a very small hut. It's basically a hut which is just long enough for a bit longer than would be necessary for someone who's about 6 feet tall to lie down in, and it's maybe by 4 feet or 5 feet, something like that. But yeah, isn't it more important that it's a genuine modest design? I think it's a good point. Rather than getting hung up on the numbers, one of the reasons why the Buddha formulated training rules or formulated rules for the monks is for the inspiration of people who are not yet inspired. So if someone's going to be designing a hut which is totally, a monk is designing a hut which is totally ostentatious and totally flamboyant and over the top in many ways, then that's not going to inspire faith. And I think by great standards, one could see that one could judge that would be an inappropriate dwelling. But again, these are for monks. So for lay people who aren't monks, you have to ask yourself, what are your, why? What is the purpose? What does it mean to have an optimum in your lodging? I think for most people, considerations of, how much, how many people are in your family is one thing, but also other considerations. It really doesn't have to be. I'll reiterate. It's not, just the minimal. That's not your only criteria for measuring things. If you intend to entertain people, or if you intend to, have friends over and be a good host and be a generous host, then you might want a bigger house, and that's totally fair enough. And one kind of interesting thing is that in certain religious traditions, there are many, many rules and very explicit and detailed rules for everyone who's practicing that religion. Whereas in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha did lay out very intricate and detailed, extremely detailed rules for monastics, people who are voluntarily taking on the practice of the Dhamma. But he didn't really, other than suggesting for people who voluntarily want to, and you can take on the 5 precepts and avoid wrong livelihood of certain types. Don't sell meat, or don't trade in humans, or don't trade in poisons, or don't trade in alcohol, etc. But other than that, he didn't try to control monastic or control lay people. So there's another question. So what strategies would you recommend to combat tina middha, which is sloth and torpor? You mentioned experimenting with hours of sleep to find the optimum, but what if you have issues with maintaining the optimum? So this is a really good point. First, for many people who come to meditation find that tina middha, or this sloth and torpor, are basically one way that I think Joseph Goldstein refines it is as tina middha is that which retreats from difficulty. So it's the mind that when you experience a little bit of mental or physical pain, you just try to numb it out, and just the mind tries to shut itself off to not deal with the pain. And one of the main causes of that is sleep deprivation. Yeah. So if you haven't been getting enough sleep, if you have a sleep debt, then that is going to have an effect on you when you sit down to meditate. And for people who've been meditating a long time, you can kind of push through that. There are ways to kind of bulldoze through sleep deprivation, and that's a skill in itself, to be able to be wakeful even with tina middha. But you can address tina middha, sloth, and torpor by just getting the right amount of sleep. If you have issues maintaining the optimum, then figure out your use of caffeine. Figure out your use of other types of stimulants, and figure out what type of person you are. This is relating to Mattaññū, so knowing yourself, the intrapersonal intelligence. Are you an owl or a lark? Do you like to stay up late? Do you have your most productive mind states when you are up in the evening, or when you're waking up early in the morning? In terms of having issues maintaining the optimum, figure out what those issues are. Are they your own issues? Is it because I don't have the discipline to follow through with what I know would be the optimum? Or is my issues that, for reasons I can't control, my job or my work or my school or my kids, all of these are my family, my spouse, my parents, whatever it is. These are all things which we don't really have control of in many ways. And when your kid is crying and you need to put them to sleep, or your work starts at this or that time, it becomes harder. And that's, I would suggest doing what you can with, what is the quote? Basically knowing the things that you can have an effect on, and trying to work with those causes. But then the things you can't change, then maybe you do just have to work on the skill of being awake with tina middha, being awake with sloth and torpor. And honestly, it's a painful practice. I mean, when you don't follow the biological urge just to close your eyes and sleep when you're sitting meditation, and you've determined I'll sit for 15 minutes, and you just keep your eyes open and try to push through it, it's painful. So some things to work with. One is just knowing that it's going to be difficult. Two, keeping your eyes open. There's absolutely no virtue in closing your eyes in meditation if you're at all inclining towards sleepiness. The right thing to do in that situation is to open your eyes. That will not only, if you're in a place that has light, that will let more light get into your pupils and will naturally wake you up that way. But it will also give you a gauge. So when you've got the tina middha, slothful mind, it's naturally trying to bend your head forward. You're naturally, nodding, and your eyes are gradually focusing downwards and contracting and trying to close. So if you can counteract all of those, keep your posture upright, your neck straight, you're not going to nod, is your plan, and you're not going to close the aperture of your eyes, you're not going to close your eyelids. These are all very manifest practical things you can do. So nice questions, friends. I'm going to post the Zoom link. So this will be the end of the Q&A session, but we're going to move over to Zoom, and anyone who has a question can bring that over there, or just bring in, if you want conversation, I'd love to hear your perspective. So, all right, there's the Zoom link, and maybe see some of you there. And if not, maybe see you next week or see your name next week. And wish you all a good evening and a good night.